The smell hit the palace guards first, a sickening blend of honey, sweat, and rotting flesh. In the throne room of Memphis, Pharaoh Pepi II sat motionless on his golden chair, while dozens of naked slaves stood around him, their bodies glistening with thick honey that dripped onto the marble floors. Flies swarmed them in black clouds, covering their eyes, filling their mouths, turning them into living flypaper. The slaves weren't allowed to move, speak, or brush away the insects slowly driving them mad. They were human fly traps, keeping the god-king free from the annoyance of insects while he conducted the business of ruling Egypt. This wasn't punishment for some crime. This was simply Tuesday in the palace of the longest reigning monarch in human history. After 94 years on the throne, Pepi II had descended so far into decadence and madness that he'd turned human beings into furniture, and he wasn't even close to being the most twisted pharaoh in Egyptian history. That honour belongs to rulers who made Caligula look stable, who turned the gift of the Nile into a blood-soaked nightmare, who proved that absolute power, combined with religious delusion, creates monsters that defy comprehension. These weren't just bad kings, they were living gods whose insanity became law, whose perversions became ritual, whose paranoia killed thousands. From pharaohs who married their own daughters to those who erased entire cities from existence, from rulers who drank human blood to those who buried their courts alive. This is the story of what happens when madness wears the double crown of Egypt. The pyramids weren't the only things these kings built. They constructed monuments to depravity that would horrify even the darkest corners of human imagination. Pepi II Neferkara ascended to the throne at age 6 and refused to leave it for 94 years, watching Egypt crumble around him while he pursued increasingly deranged pleasures. By the time he reached his 80s, the once mighty pharaoh had outlived 7 generations of officials, creating a government of sycophants and incompetents who enabled his every twisted whim. The honey slaves were just the beginning. He ordered the construction of a pyramid for his favourite dwarf, larger than those built for queens. He married his own daughters and granddaughters, creating a web of incest so complex that court scribes gave up tracking bloodlines. When his favourite queen died, he had her mummified in a standing position and placed in his bedchamber, conducting conversations with the corpse for the remaining decades of his reign. But Pepi's true madness manifested in his treatment of provincial governors who displeased him. One inscription describes him ordering a governor's entire family, 3 generations including infants, to be slowly roasted alive over bronze braziers while he ate figs and dictated poetry. Another text, carefully preserved by horrified scribes, details how he punished a tax collector who brought insufficient tribute. The man's children were flayed before his eyes, their skins made into drums that were beaten during the collector's own execution. These weren't isolated incidents, but regular occurrences in the final decades of his reign. Egypt's economy collapsed as governors focused on avoiding the pharaoh's attention rather than administering their provinces. The irrigation systems that fed millions fell into disrepair, while Pepi obsessed over the perfect temperature for his honey slaves. His death at around 100 years old came as Egypt teetered on total collapse. The succession was chaos. He'd outlived all legitimate heirs, except those produced through incest, creating a genetic disaster of claimants. Within a decade, the Old Kingdom fell into what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a dark age of civil war and famine directly caused by Pepi's century of madness. But even as Egypt burned, his pyramid texts celebrated him as the eternal one who never tires, a sick joke considering he'd exhausted an entire civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests mass graves from this period, filled with victims of the famines and wars his misrule created. One papyrus fragment contains what might be history's first recorded curse against a pharaoh. May Pepi's car wander hungry through eternity, as we hunger because of him. Yet compared to Akhenaten, Pepi II was merely eccentric. Born Amenhotep IV around 1380 BCE, the pharaoh who would rename himself Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, didn't just abuse power, he rewrote reality itself. His reign began normally enough, but within 5 years something snapped. Maybe it was the deformities visible in his statues, the elongated skull, feminine hips and distorted features that suggest Marfan syndrome, or another genetic condition. Maybe it was political calculation gone wrong, or maybe it was genuine religious mania. Whatever the cause, Akhenaten declared war on 3,000 years of Egyptian religion, proclaiming that only one god existed, the Aten, the physical disk of the sun. Every other deity, from Amun-Ra to Osiris, was not just false but evil, their very names to be chiseled from existence. The persecution began with priests and escalated to ordinary Egyptians. Akhenaten created a secret police called the Seekers of Blasphemy, who burst into homes searching for amulets of forbidden gods. Possession meant death, usually by being staked out in the desert to die of exposure under the loving gaze of the Aten. He ordered the destruction of temples that had stood since the Pyramid Age, their gold stripped to build his new capital, Akhetaten, modern Amarna, in the middle of nowhere. Tens of thousands of workers died constructing this city, their bodies dumped in mass graves recently discovered by archaeologists. Those who survived faced a bizarre existence, required to worship in open-air temples under the blazing sun, forbidden to seek shade during ceremonies that lasted hours. Heatstroke victims who collapsed were considered unworthy of the Aten's glory and left to die where they fell. But Akhenaten's twisted theology went beyond mere monotheism. He declared himself and his queen Nefertiti the sole intermediaries between humanity and God, making worship of them equal to worship of the Aten. Palace reliefs show the royal couple in increasingly bizarre poses, Akhenaten with pendulous breasts and wide hips, Nefertiti with an elongated skull that defied nature. Whether these represented reality or religious symbolism remains debated, but the effect was clear. The royal family had become as alien as their god. They appeared nude in public ceremonies, their deformed bodies presented as divine perfection. Courtiers were forced to imitate these deformities, binding their children's skulls and padding their clothes to match the royal physique. One tomb painting shows nobles prostrating before the king while wearing false breasts and hip padding, a grotesque parody of divinity that would be comic if not for the lives it destroyed. The human cost of Akhenaten's religious revolution defies calculation. Traditional festivals that fed the poor were abolished. Temple holdings that supported millions were confiscated. Priests who'd spent lifetimes serving now forbidden gods faced execution or starvation. But the true horror lay in Akhenaten's treatment of his own family. His secondary wives and their children were erased from records when they failed to produce the divine physique he demanded. Archaeological evidence suggests at least 12 royal children simply vanished during his reign. His own brother Smenkhkare may have been forced into a sexual relationship, depicted in art as Akhenaten's beloved, in poses typically reserved for queens. When daughter Mentuhotep died in childbirth, possibly pregnant by her own father, Akhenaten's grief took psychotic form. He had the girl mummified in a standing position, dressed in queen's regalia, and placed in the throne room where courtiers had to address the corpse, as if alive. The end came swiftly once Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE. His successor, the boy King Tutankhamun, possibly his son, immediately began reversing the madness. Akhetaten was abandoned so quickly that bread was left in ovens, tools dropped mid-use. The city became a ghost town within months, its revolutionary temples collapsing into sand. Akhenaten's name was chiseled from monuments just as he'd erased other gods. His mummy has never been found, suggesting deliberate destruction. But the damage was done. Egypt had been economically devastated, internationally humiliated, and religiously traumatized. The priesthoods he'd destroyed took generations to rebuild. The very name Akhenaten became a curse, referenced in later texts only as the criminal or the enemy. His twisted vision of divine truth had nearly destroyed the world's oldest continuous civilization. If Akhenaten represented religious madness, Kamose embodied pure sadism disguised as tradition. Fourth son of Ramesses II, Kamose earned history's approval as a restorer of monuments and high priest of Ptah. But recently translated papyri reveal a darker passion, human sacrifice, on a scale Egypt hadn't seen since prehistoric times. Under the guise of restoring ancient rituals, Kamose reinstituted practices abandoned for centuries. When dedicating restored pyramids, he buried workers alive in the foundations, claiming their life force would strengthen the structures. Modern excavations have found dozens of skeletons in positions suggesting live burial, their fingernails broken from clawing at stones. But this was merely practice for his grander vision. Kamose believed that Egypt's decline from its pyramid-building peak stemmed from abandoning human sacrifice. The old kings, he argued, had understood that divine favour required blood. His position as high priest gave him religious authority. His status as prince provided immunity from consequences. He began with criminals, having them mummified alive, a process that involved removing organs while the victim remained conscious, their screams muffled by resin-soaked bandages. He progressed to slaves, then to free Egyptians who violated obscure religious laws he'd invented. A baker who sold bread on a festival day was mummified alive with his entire family. A scribe who misspelled a sacred name suffered the same fate. The workshops of Memphis reeked with the specific horror of conscious mummification. A smell witnesses described as sweetness mixed with screaming. His masterwork of horror came during the Sed festival of his father Rameses II. Traditional Sed festivals celebrated a pharaoh's continued vitality through ritual and pageantry. Kamose convinced his elderly father that a true Sed festival, as practiced by the earliest kings, required the sacrifice of rivals to ensure divine favour. 39 princes from competing dynasties were brought to Memphis under pretense of celebration. Over 3 days, Kamose had them mummified alive in public ceremonies, their bandaged forms arranged in seated positions around Ramesses' throne. The old pharaoh, perhaps senile or perhaps as twisted as his son, accepted this tableau of wrapped, still-breathing victims as proper tribute. Foreign ambassadors fled Egypt in horror, their reports spreading tales of Egyptian madness throughout the Mediterranean. Kamose saw their flight as validation. The gods had shown Egypt's superiority through superior cruelty. But perhaps no pharaoh combined political cunning with personal depravity quite like Amenhotep, a lesser-known ruler of the Second Intermediate Period, whose brief reign left scars that outlasted dynasties. Rising to power through assassination, Amenhotep ruled for only 6 years, but managed to transform Egypt into a charnel house that would make the Aztecs squeamish. His particular obsession was blood, not metaphorically, but literally. Palace accounts describe daily baths in human blood, drained from virgin girls selected for their beauty. He believed blood bathing would grant eternal youth, a delusion that required hundreds of victims annually. The selection process became a state institution, with officials called Seekers of Purity, who examined girls in every village, taking the most beautiful for the pharaoh's baths. The logistics of Amenhotep's blood obsession created an infrastructure of horror. Special draining rooms were constructed beneath the palace, equipped with bronze tables tilted to channel blood into collection pools. Victims were kept alive as long as possible to ensure fresh flow. Their veins opened carefully to maximize output. Palace physicians developed techniques to prevent quick death, tourniquets to control bleeding, stimulants to maintain consciousness, salt solutions to replace lost volume. Some victims took days to die, their fading heartbeats pumping out the pharaoh's bathwater. The drained corpses were burned to prevent evidence, but archaeological surveys have found layers of human ash beneath palace foundations, suggesting thousands of victims over his 6-year reign. Amenhotep's madness wasn't limited to bloodbaths. He instituted creative justice for crimes real and imagined. A merchant who delivered spoiled grain watched his children baked into bread and force-fed to him until his stomach ruptured. A diplomat who brought unwelcome news had his tongue pulled out, stretched, dried and used as a bookmark in royal scrolls. An architect whose building developed cracks was sealed inside a pillar of his own construction, his muffled screams audible for days. But his true innovation was generational punishment. Criminals' families were tortured in ways that mirrored the original crime. A thief's children had their hands cut off. A spy's family had their eyes burned out. These mutilated innocents were then released to wander Egypt as living warnings, creating a population of maimed beggars that chroniclers described as Amenhotep's Garden of Suffering. The bloodbaths failed to grant eternal youth. Amenhotep died at 32, reportedly from infection caused by bathing in contaminated blood. His death sparked nationwide celebrations so intense that his burial was rushed, his tomb modest by pharaonic standards. Later rulers avoided mentioning his name, referring to his reign only as the Red Years. But physical evidence of his atrocities keeps surfacing. Construction projects regularly uncover mass graves from his era. Chemical analysis of palace stones shows human blood baked into the very foundations. One recovered papyrus contains what might be a victim's account. I am Nefertiti, taken in my 14th year. They drain us slowly in the dark. The pharaoh bathes while we die. The gods have abandoned Egypt. The fragment ends there, its author presumably drained for a monster's vanity. Yet even Amenhotep's calculated cruelty pales before the apocalyptic madness of Siptah, last significant ruler of the 19th dynasty. Born with a clubfoot that Egyptian medicine couldn't correct, Siptah developed a pathological hatred of physical perfection. His reign became a war against beauty itself. He ordered the systematic mutilation of anyone considered attractive: men, women, children. His agents, called balancers, roamed Egypt with bronze tools designed for specific disfigurements. Beautiful eyes were burned with heated needles. Straight limbs were broken and allowed to heal crooked. Symmetrical faces were scarred in patterns that destroyed harmony. This wasn't random violence, but artistic sadism. Siptah personally designed mutilation patterns, creating an aesthetic of ugliness he considered true beauty. The pharaoh's court became a gallery of the grotesque: advisors missing noses, queens with scarred faces, princes hobbling on deliberately broken legs. Foreign ambassadors reported being unable to eat after audiences, sickened by the parade of mutilated courtiers. But Siptah's ultimate project was his Garden of New Forms, a compound where pregnant women were fed drugs and subjected to bindings designed to deform their unborn children. He believed he could create new types of humans, freed from the tyranny of normal form. The few readable accounts from this period describe infants born with deliberately induced deformities, raised in the compound as Siptah's true children. Most died young, but those who survived were displayed at festivals as examples of divine creativity. One chronicle mentions a child with fused limbs whom Siptah declared more perfect than the gods themselves. Siptah's reign ended when his own deformity experiments backfired. Attempting to improve his clubfoot through repeated breaking and reshaping, he developed bone infection that spread throughout his body. His final months were spent in agony that palace drugs couldn't ease, his screams echoing through halls filled with the mutilated victims of his aesthetic madness. He died at 20, leaving Egypt traumatized and economically ruined. His successor, Tuzret, spent her brief reign trying to undo the damage, but the psychological scars lasted generations. Egyptian art from this period shows a notable shift. Fewer, idealized forms, more realistic depictions including physical imperfections. Some historians argue Siptah inadvertently democratized Egyptian art by destroying the cult of perfect beauty. Others see only the wreckage of a civilization driven mad by a madman's rule. The final twisted pharaoh in our chronicle ruled much later, during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek and Egyptian traditions merged into new forms of depravity. Ptolemy XI, Alexander II, inherited both Macedonian ruthlessness and Egyptian god complex, creating a synthesis of cruelty that shocked even Romans. His 19-day reign in 80 BCE packed more horror than most rulers manage in decades. Arriving in Alexandria after years of exile, he immediately married his stepmother Cleopatra Berenice III, then murdered her within days to claim sole rule. But this was merely the opening act of his brief, bloody performance. He declared a cleansing of Alexandria, ordering soldiers to kill anyone who'd served his stepmother. Administrators, guards, even kitchen slaves. The massacre lasted 3 days, turning the palace into an abattoir. But Ptolemy XI's true innovation was philosophical sadism. Educated in Greek philosophy, he twisted Platonic ideals into justifications for atrocity. He argued that suffering purified the soul, that pain brought wisdom, that death was the ultimate philosophical experience. To test these theories, he had scholars tortured while debating metaphysics, recording their arguments as pain increased. One account describes a mathematician proving theorems while being slowly flayed, his proofs becoming increasingly abstract as shock set in. Ptolemy considered this philosophy in its purest form and had the blood-stained scrolls preserved in the Library of Alexandria. He planned similar experiments with poets, musicians and artists, believing extreme suffering would produce ultimate art. His reign ended as violently as it began. After 19 days, the Alexandrian mob stormed the palace, dragging Ptolemy XI to the gymnasium where they tore him apart with their bare hands. His dismembered remains were scattered through the city streets, each piece kicked and spat upon by citizens who'd lived in terror, even for those brief days. Later historians noted that his death united Alexandria's fractious population, Greeks, Egyptians and Jews working together to destroy a common enemy. His name was formally cursed, his statues melted down, his brief writings burned. Yet fragments survive in later compilations, his twisted fusion of philosophy and sadism influencing certain Roman emperors who found inspiration in his intellectual approach to cruelty. One recovered text contains his final thesis: pain is the only truth, death the only wisdom, and a king who brings both is the greatest philosopher. The Alexandrians provided emphatic peer review. These kings represent only a fraction of Egyptian pharaonic madness. The full catalogue would include Nitocris, who allegedly drowned an entire court in an underground dining hall, Mentuhotep, who fed defeated enemies to sacred crocodiles while their families watched, Pharaoh, whose pyramid contained suspicious numbers of juvenile skeletons suggesting child sacrifice. Each twisted ruler built upon precedents set by predecessors, creating a tradition of divine madness that spanned 3,000 years. The stable, monument-building pharaohs we celebrate were exceptions in a succession of god-kings whose absolute power created absolute corruption. Behind every pyramid lies suffering we can barely comprehend, ordered by rulers whose names we've deliberately forgotten. What's truly terrifying about these twisted pharaohs isn't their individual madness, it's how their societies enabled them. Thousands of officials carried out insane orders. Priests justified atrocities as divine will. Scribes carefully recorded horrors for posterity. Ordinary Egyptians participated in systems of cruelty that seem impossible to modern minds. But are we really so different? Every society has its enabling structures, its willingness to follow orders, its capacity to normalize evil when it comes wrapped in authority. The honey-covered slaves of Pepi II aren't that far removed from modern atrocities committed in the name of ideology or security. These pharaohs remind us that human civilization is always just one mad leader away from horror. They had no checks on their power, no systems to contain their madness, no way to stop a god-king who decided suffering was sacred. We tell ourselves we've evolved beyond such things, but have we? Or have we just gotten better at hiding the honey slaves, at justifying the bloodbaths, at pretending our rulers aren't capable of ancient evils with modern efficiency? If these stories disturbed you, they should. They're warnings from history about what happens when power meets pathology. Subscribe if you want more uncomfortable truths from the past, the kind that reveal just how thin the line between civilization and savagery really is. Because forgetting these monsters doesn't prevent new ones. It just ensures we won't recognize them until it's too late.